There's a moment that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, no loud realization, no sudden confession, no big emotional scene. Just a quiet shift inside them, the kind that creeps in when everything slows down and distractions stop working the way they used to. It doesn't come when they're busy or surrounded by noise, it comes in stillness. And when it does, it feels heavy. Not sharp, not explosive, just this deep sinking awareness that something important might have slipped through their hands, something they didn't fully understand while they had it, something they may have pushed away without realizing the weight of what they were doing. And the hardest part is, by the time this feeling reaches the surface, it's already too late to go back to how things were. That's the truth most people don't talk about. When an avoidant starts to feel like they screwed it up, it doesn't come with clarity first, it comes with discomfort they can't explain. And instead of turning toward that feeling, instead of reaching out or trying to fix it, their first instinct is to do what they've always done, create more distance. It sounds backwards, but for them, distance feels safer than facing the possibility that they caused something real to fall apart, because facing it would mean sitting with emotions they've spent a lifetime learning how to avoid, so they pull back even more. They become quieter, harder to read, more disconnected, not because they don't care, but because caring now feels like pressure, and pressure feels like something they don't know how to handle. So from the outside, it can look like they've moved on, like they're unaffected, like it didn't matter. But internally, something very different is happening. There's tension building under the surface, a quiet conflict between what they feel and what they allow themselves to acknowledge. And they stay in that space longer than most people realize, because admitting what they feel would force them to confront something they're not ready to face. So instead, they replay everything, but they do it alone. They don't talk about it. They don't process it out loud. They don't ask for clarity. They go back through memories in silence, conversations, moments, small details that didn't seem significant at the time but now feel loaded with meaning. The way your tone shifted during certain conversations, the pauses before you said something vulnerable, the moments where you tried to get closer and they instinctively pulled away, at the time it felt like maintaining control. Now it starts to feel like something else entirely. And this is where the confusion begins to grow, because they can sense that something mattered, but they can't fully understand why it's affecting them this much now. It doesn't feel logical to them, it feels like something is out of place internally, and instead of labeling it as regret, they experience it as restlessness, irritation, a kind of emotional pressure that shows up in unexpected ways. They might feel distracted for no clear reason, slightly on edge, unable to fully relax even when nothing is technically wrong. And that's because what they're feeling hasn't been named yet. It's sitting there unresolved, slowly getting harder to ignore. But their mind steps in quickly to protect them from going too deep into that feeling. Because if they did, it would lead to a realization that challenges everything they've been telling themselves. So they start creating explanations, quiet ones at first. It wouldn't have worked anyway. It was probably for the best. Things felt off. These thoughts don't come from clarity, they come from defense. They're not trying to lie, they're trying to stabilize themselves. Because accepting that they may have pushed away something meaningful would mean accepting responsibility for the loss, and that's not an easy place for them to sit in. So they go back and forth. One moment, they feel like they made the right decision. The next, something doesn't sit right. And that internal contradiction creates even more tension, because deep down there's a part of them that knows the truth isn't as simple as the story they're telling themselves, that something real was there, that it wasn't just another passing connection. And that awareness starts to break through in small, uncomfortable waves. And then something shifts that they weren't expecting. It's not something they do, it's something you stop doing. The energy you used to bring toward them, the effort, the emotional presence, the way you tried to keep things connected, it starts to fade. Not in a dramatic way, not with confrontation or closure, but quietly, naturally. You stop reaching out the same way. You stop trying to fix what isn't being met. You stop holding space for someone who isn't showing up in it. And this is where things begin to feel different for them in a way they can't control. Because the space they once relied on starts to change. It's no longer something they chose, it's something they're experiencing from the other side. And that difference matters more than they expect. Because now, instead of feeling in control of the distance, they're inside it, feeling it, sitting with it. And it doesn't feel as comfortable as it used to. Your absence begins to register in ways they didn't anticipate. Not loudly, not all at once, but in subtle moments that catch them off guard. A thought that appears out of nowhere, a memory that lingers longer than it should, a sense that something is missing, even if they can't fully explain what. And this is the part that shifts everything internally, because distance, when it was their choice, felt like relief. But distance, when it's real, when it's mutual, when it's final, when it's no longer something they can reverse instantly, starts to feel like loss. And loss is something they don't know how to process easily. So they sit with it in the only way they know how, quietly, internally, without fully letting it surface. But it's there now, and it doesn't go away as easily as they thought it would. And once that feeling settles in, something unfamiliar begins to happen inside them, a level of awareness they're not used to sitting with for long. It doesn't arrive as a clear realization at first, it comes in fragments, small thoughts that interrupt their usual patterns, moments where they catch themselves recognizing something they normally avoid seeing. The way they pulled back when things started getting deeper, the way they hesitated when emotional closeness was asked of them, the way they convinced themselves that distance was the safer option even when part of them didn't fully want it. And for a brief moment, they see it. Not just what happened, but the pattern behind it. The cycle that has quietly repeated itself in different forms. Getting close, feeling something real begin to build, then slowly becoming overwhelmed by it, until creating space feels like the only way to regain control. And in the past, that cycle didn't feel like a problem. It felt like self-protection. But now, sitting in the aftermath of losing something that actually mattered, it starts to feel different. It starts to feel like a pattern that cost them something real. And that realization doesn't bring relief. It brings discomfort. Because seeing the pattern means they can't fully blame circumstances anymore. It means they have to face the possibility that the common factor in these situations is them. And that's not an easy place to stay in. So they don't stay there for long. They move in and out of that awareness. One moment, they see it clearly. The next, they push it away and return to familiar thoughts that feel safer. But even when they try to distract themselves, that awareness doesn't completely disappear. It lingers in the background, quietly reshaping how they view what happened. And this is where something even more complicated begins to take form. The feeling that maybe they should say something, not in a dramatic, fully vulnerable way, but in a small, cautious way. Just enough to ease the tension they're feeling, just enough to test if the connection is still there in some form. But the moment that thought appears, it's immediately followed by hesitation, because now it feels different. Reaching out isn't as simple as it would have been before. Before, there was a sense of familiarity, of knowing that the connection was still open, still accessible. Now there's uncertainty, a question they don't have an answer to. What if you've already moved on? What if the space they created gave you clarity? What if the version of you that used to be there for them isn't there anymore? And that possibility creates a kind of pressure they're not comfortable with. Because now, reaching out carries risk. It means facing whatever response comes back, or even worse, facing silence. And silence in this situation would confirm something they're not ready to accept, that the connection they once had access to might no longer be available to them in the same way. So instead of fully reaching out, they start to move in subtle ways. Small actions that don't require full vulnerability. A reaction to something you post. A short, casual message that doesn't address anything directly. A check-in that feels almost neutral on the surface. And these actions aren't random, they're intentional but careful. They're trying to understand where they stand without fully exposing themselves. It's trying to see if there's still a response, still a connection, still something they can step back into without having to confront everything all at once. But at the same time, there's something holding them back from going deeper. And that something isn't just fear of rejection, It's something heavier. It's the weight of knowing, on some level, that they were the one who created the distance in the first place, that they were the one who pulled away when things were still there to be worked through. And that awareness turns into something that feels a lot like shame, not the loud kind, not the kind that's openly expressed, but a quiet internal heaviness that makes it harder for them to act. Because reaching out now wouldn't just be about reconnecting, it would mean acknowledging what they did. It would mean facing the impact of their actions. And for someone who struggles with emotional vulnerability, that can feel overwhelming. So they stay in that middle space, wanting to say something, but not knowing how to say it in a way that feels safe. And in that space, another thought begins to form, one that feels easier to hold on to, even if it's not entirely true. The idea that maybe, if things were meant to happen, they would have happened differently, that maybe timing played a bigger role than their own actions, that maybe the connection itself wasn't as stable as it seemed. And these thoughts don't come from clarity, they come from the need to reduce the discomfort they're feeling. Because if they can believe that it wasn't entirely in their control, then they don't have to fully sit with the idea that they let something meaningful slip away. But even as they hold on to that explanation, something inside them doesn't fully settle. Because deep down, there's a quiet recognition that it wasn't just timing. It wasn't just circumstances. It was the moment things became real, that everything started to shift for them. And that's the part they don't say out loud. The truth that feels too vulnerable to fully admit, that they didn't leave because something was missing, they pulled away because something was actually there, something that required emotional presence, something that asked them to stay, to open up, to move beyond their comfort zone. And instead of leaning into that, they stepped back. Not because they didn't feel anything, but because what they felt started to feel too real. And now, sitting with the absence of that connection, they begin to understand something they didn't fully see before. That the very thing they were trying to avoid, closeness, vulnerability, emotional depth, might have been the thing that made it meaningful in the first place. And this realization doesn't come all at once. It builds slowly, in moments they can't always predict. But once it starts forming, it becomes harder to ignore because it changes how they view everything that happened. It shifts the narrative from "it wasn't right" to something much more uncomfortable: "maybe I wasn't ready." And that thought stays with them longer than they expect. And when that thought starts to settle in, "maybe I wasn't ready," it doesn't just pass through them and disappear, it lingers. It reshapes how they see themselves in ways they're not used to confronting. Because for so long, the narrative felt easier when it was external. It was about timing, compatibility, circumstances, things that didn't quite align. But now the focus shifts inward. And that shift is uncomfortable in a way that's hard to explain unless you felt it. Because it's not just about losing someone anymore. It's about realizing you may have been the reason something meaningful didn't have the chance to grow. And that kind of awareness doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels heavy. It feels like something they don't know what to do with. So instead of fully accepting it, they start moving between two emotional states. One where they acknowledge it quietly, and one where they try to escape it completely. There are moments where everything becomes clear to them, where they can see how their distance created confusion, how their silence may have felt like rejection, how their hesitation may have slowly pushed you away. And in those moments, there's a kind of clarity that almost leads to action. Almost. But right when they get close to doing something about it, something inside them pulls them back again, because acting on that clarity would require them to step into vulnerability in a way they've avoided for a long time. It would require them to admit, not just to you, but to themselves, that they mishandled something that mattered. And that's where the internal conflict deepens. Because now it's not just about reaching out. It's about how they would even begin to explain themselves. How do you come back from distance without sounding inconsistent? How do you express regret when you're not used to expressing emotion clearly? How do you open a door that you were the one to close without knowing if it will still open? These questions don't have easy answers for them, and instead of pushing through that discomfort, they often stay stuck in it, thinking about what they could say, imagining how it might go, but never fully taking the step. And while they stay in that hesitation, time continues to move forward, quietly, steadily, without waiting for them to figure it out. And at the same time, something else begins to shift inside them, something they didn't expect to feel. The sense of independence they once leaned on so heavily, the space they once protected so carefully, starts to feel different. It's not that they suddenly stop valuing their independence, it's that the meaning of it changes. Because now, instead of feeling like freedom, it starts to feel like something is missing within it. The quiet becomes too quiet. The space feels heavier than it used to. The distractions don't land the same way. And in those moments where they're alone with their thoughts, there's a subtle awareness that something they pushed away might have added something to their life that they can't easily replace. And this is where the comparison begins, even if they don't realize it right away. It's not always conscious. It doesn't always show up as direct thoughts like, that was better. It shows up in small, almost invisible ways. Conversations with others that feel a little more surface level than they expected. Moments that should feel engaging but don't fully hold their attention. Interactions that are fine on the outside but don't create the same internal response. And slowly, without fully intending to, they start noticing the difference. Not in a dramatic or exaggerated way, but in a quiet recognition that what they experienced before had a depth to it that isn't easily recreated. And that realization stays with them longer than they expect. But even with that awareness, they still hesitate. Because by now, the situation feels more complicated than it did in the beginning. It's no longer just about missing something, it's about wondering if they even have the right to come back into your space. Because they know, on some level, that you didn't just disappear for no reason. That your distance came after trying, after showing up, after giving them opportunities to meet you halfway. And that awareness creates another layer of hesitation. Because now reaching out doesn't just feel risky, it feels like something they have to justify. And they're not sure how to do that without confronting parts of themselves they've spent a long time avoiding. So instead, they lean into a thought that feels easier to carry, even if it's not entirely true. The idea that maybe it was just a matter of timing, that maybe things could have worked if the circumstances were different, that maybe in another version of events, things would have unfolded in a way that didn't lead to distance. And this thought becomes something they return to often, not because it fully satisfies them, but because it softens the weight of responsibility. It gives them a way to process the situation without fully confronting the role they played in it. But even as they hold on to that belief, there's something underneath it that doesn't fully settle. Because deep down, they know it wasn't just timing. They know that the moment things started becoming emotionally real, something shifted inside them, that the connection didn't fall apart on its own. It was something they stepped away from when it required more presence than they were ready to give. And that truth stays with them in a way they can't fully ignore. It shows up in quiet moments, in reflections they didn't plan to have, in the subtle understanding that if the same situation happened again, they might respond the same way unless something inside them changes. And that's where the real conflict begins to take shape. Because now it's not just about the past anymore, it's about what this realization means for them moving forward. Whether they choose to face it or whether they let it become just another experience they quietly move on from without fully understanding. And that choice isn't always conscious. It's something that unfolds over time, through small decisions, through moments where they either lean into discomfort or retreat from it. And while all of this is happening internally for them, something equally important is happening on the outside. You're changing. Not in a way that's loud or reactive, but in a way that's grounded. You're no longer holding on to the same expectations. You're no longer waiting in the same emotional space. You're no longer trying to make something work that requires effort from both sides. And that shift doesn't go unnoticed. Even if they don't see it directly, they feel it. In the way your energy is no longer reaching toward them. In the way the connection they once had access to no longer feels as open. And that realization creates a different kind of pressure, one they can't control the way they used to. Because now it's not just about what they feel, it's about what they may have already lost. And that realization lands differently than anything before it. It's no longer abstract. It's no longer something they can soften with explanations or push aside with distractions. It starts to feel real in a way that settles deep in their chest, quiet, undeniable, and heavy. The possibility that you're not just stepping back temporarily, but actually moving forward without them, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that gives them a clear moment of closure, but in a steady, grounded way that doesn't revolve around them anymore. And that's what makes it harder to process, because there's no clear ending to react to, just a slow shift that becomes more obvious the longer they sit with it. And this is where the internal battle reaches its peak. Because now every thought starts to circle around one question they can't escape. Is it too late? And that question doesn't come with an easy answer. It shows up in quiet moments in the middle of their day when they're not expecting it. It interrupts their focus. It lingers longer than they want it to. And the more they think about it, the more they realize that time didn't just pause while they were figuring themselves out. It moved forward, you moved forward, and now whatever chance they had to fix things doesn't feel as accessible as it once did. And that realization creates a pressure they're not used to handling, because for the first time, the outcome isn't something they can control by creating distance. Distance doesn't solve this. Distance is what created it. So they sit in that tension, caught between the urge to reach out and the fear that reaching out might confirm what they're not ready to hear. Because at this point, silence has started to feel safer than the truth. As long as they don't act, they can still hold on to the possibility that maybe something is still there, but the moment they reach out, that possibility becomes reality, whatever that reality may be. And that uncertainty keeps them frozen, thinking about what they could say, replaying different versions of how it might go, imagining both outcomes, one where you respond and one where you don't. And sometimes the second one feels heavier than they can handle, because it wouldn't just be rejection, it would be confirmation that the connection they once had is no longer available to them in the same way. And while they stay in that hesitation, something else quietly begins to surface, something deeper than fear, deeper than uncertainty. It's the recognition of what you actually meant to them, not just as a connection, not just as someone who was there, but as someone who brought a kind of emotional presence into their life that they didn't fully understand while it was happening. The way you showed up, the way you tried to communicate, the way you created space for something real to grow. And at the time, parts of that may have felt overwhelming to them. It may have felt like too much, too fast, too emotionally demanding. But now, looking back, it starts to feel different. It starts to feel like something rare, something that required a level of emotional availability they weren't ready to meet, but something that mattered more than they allowed themselves to admit. And this is where the truth becomes unavoidable, not the softened version they told themselves before, not the version shaped by timing or circumstances, but the deeper truth that sits underneath everything, that they didn't walk away because you weren't enough. They didn't create distance because something was missing. They did it because what was there started to feel real. And real meant vulnerability. Real meant being seen. Real meant stepping out of the emotional patterns they've relied on for so long. And instead of leaning into that, they stepped back. Not because they didn't feel anything, but because they felt something they didn't know how to hold on to. And once that truth fully lands, it changes everything internally. Because now they can't go back to the simpler explanations. They can't fully convince themselves that it just wasn't meant to be. They can't ignore the role they played in how things unfolded, and that awareness brings them to a point where they have to face a choice, even if they don't consciously frame it that way. A choice between staying in the same patterns or actually confronting what those patterns have cost them. And that choice isn't easy. Because growth for them doesn't just mean understanding what happened, it means doing something different the next time they feel that same emotional pressure. It means staying when their instinct is to leave. It means opening up when their instinct is to shut down. It means risking vulnerability in a way that feels unfamiliar and uncomfortable. And not everyone reaches that point. Some will feel this awareness, sit with it for a while, and then slowly let it fade as they return to what feels familiar. They'll carry a quiet sense of what could have been, but they won't fully act on it. And over time, that feeling becomes something they tuck away, something they don't revisit often. But others Others reach a point where they can't ignore it anymore, where the pattern becomes too clear, too consistent, too costly to keep repeating without question. And for them, this moment becomes something different. It becomes a turning point, not because they suddenly become emotionally open overnight, but because they start to recognize that avoiding vulnerability hasn't protected them the way they thought it would. It's kept them safe from discomfort, but it's also kept them from holding on to something meaningful. And while all of this is unfolding inside them, your journey has already started moving in a different direction. You've already stepped out of the space where you were waiting, hoping, trying to understand. You've already started grounding yourself in something more stable, something that doesn't depend on someone else's emotional availability. And whether they fully see that or not, they feel it. In the distance, in the shift, in the way the connection no longer feels the same from their side. And that's what makes this moment so significant. Because it's no longer just about what they feel or what they realize, it's about what they choose to do with that awareness. And here's the truth that most people don't say clearly enough. When an avoidant thinks they screwed it up, that moment of awareness is real. The feelings they experience in that space are real. The regret, the confusion, the internal conflict, it's all real. But awareness alone doesn't change outcomes. Feeling something deeply doesn't automatically translate into action. And that's the part that matters most. Because you can be on their mind, you can be something they think about, something they reflect on, something they even regret losing, and still not be something they come back and fight for. And that's where your clarity comes in, not based on what they feel, but based on what they do. Because real change doesn't show up in quiet realizations alone, it shows up in consistent action, in the willingness to step into discomfort, in the ability to communicate, to take responsibility, to meet you in a space that requires emotional presence. And if that doesn't happen, then no matter what they feel internally, the outcome remains the same. So when you look back at what happened, when you think about the connection, when you wonder if they ever realized what they lost, the answer is this. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they feel it more deeply than you would expect. But the deeper truth isn't about whether they realized it. It's about whether they were able to rise to the level required to hold on to it. And that is what makes all the difference.